Hello.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm very well. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thank you. And I'm really appreciative of you taking the time today to talk about Ahsoka because I loved this series and I can only imagine how exciting it must have been for you to come on board a show like this one that fans have been waiting for, well, for years and years and years.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start with one of my favorite sequences, I think a lot of people, and that's the world between worlds. And I'm curious, obviously, we had seen that in Star Wars Rebels, but that is animated in a very different medium to live action. So, what was the challenge for you in translating that visual style for this series, would you say, in creating that world?
I think a lot of it comes down to audiences are familiar with that world through animation, of course. And so the limitations of animation and but also the subtleties of their tools and their techniques um, all go into what that look is. And then trying to kind of create a live action version of it, we had to start to interpret a lot of the things that we were seeing, a lot of the details in the things that we were seeing. So, for example, um, the uh, the motion of the actual walkway underneath people's feet. What do the edge of the actual walkways look like? Dave spent quite a bit of time as he was talking us through the visuals to try to put logic into what was creating these pathways and how they were being lit up. So very early, Dave kind of came to us and showed us some imagery of laser pointers photographed through dust, and he would photograph some of these images himself. And then at the same time, I think we were down on the LED volume one afternoon, and somebody was shining a laser pointer at the screen. We were just doing some walkthroughs, some tests, and the physical the stage inside the volume was being dressed with lots of dirt for an upcoming scene, and some of the dirt was kind of in the air. So I had Andrew Jones, the production designer, grab some dirt and basically just pat it through the laser point, and I videoed that because he had a lot of movement in it. And so I sent it to Dave around the same time he was looking at laser pointer reference himself. So we kind of came together on what this could be, which is that the edges of the walkways is almost like a beam of light that's going through it, and it's kind of lighting up space dust, for want of a better phrase. So it was really that it was interpreting what's already been there and trying to put some physics behind it, because that's really what live action filmmaking relies so heavily on. You have to believe the physics, you have to believe what it is that you're seeing, you have to believe that somebody could put a camera there, in most cases at least, to believe the imagery that you're seeing. So that was a big part of it.
Yeah, well, just an incredible sequence with how it came together. And of course, something else we saw in that episode, I know as a fan, I didn't necessarily think I'd ever see in live action, were those Clone Wars battlefield
Yeah.
flashbacks. So, what was it like to work on those? And specifically, when we saw Anakin's transition into Vader with those flashes as well, I thought was a great, subtle kind of visual in those.
Yeah, again, Dave kind of came to the table with a very clear idea of what he wanted to see. He'd obviously worked with Doug Chang's art department for a while to kind of develop some key art. So for us, we were well aware of visually what we were being asked to do, but there was a lot of subtleties that the artwork didn't pick up that we only understood talking to Dave about this. And first and foremost, it was very, very clear to us early on how important those scenes were to Dave in particular, but how he felt it was going to be very important to the fans of the animated shows where Clone Wars, where it's been featured in the past, and he wanted to get it right. So one of the things very early on that he talked about is the fact that despite the fact that the scenes had a heavy amount of atmosphere in there, and you would in theory be able to kind of see deep into the scene. He wanted to make sure that it felt almost dreamlike from the viewer's perspective. So Ahsoka's basically having this flashback moment. She's remembering. There's a memory that she's recalling, but because she never went deep into that scene, she wouldn't have all the information as to what happens over there. So Dave didn't want to show the audience necessarily. He wanted to kind of, but he didn't want it blurry, and he didn't want it. He didn't want to kind of do an effect over the top to make it kind of dreamlike. You know, your cliched kind of wobbly backgrounds. So we kind of lent into this kind of heavy atmosphere. And one of the first things that we did, I was working with TC Harrison, who was the associate VFX supervisor working with me, and I kind of assigned him to look at how we would go about executing that sequence the best way, because I knew it was going to be a real challenge to the compositors, right? So if you start shooting with all of that atmosphere in there, and you have blue screens in the background, you're not really providing a blue screen for the compositors to use as a, you know, a magic wand to create an extraction, because the value is constantly changing. So is there any value at all in putting a blue screen back there? So we were kind of talking through this idea, and it became, and then we were talking to some VFX supervisors at ILM that worked on different scenes, particularly the one in Solo, where they landed on the planet, which escapes me, where the battle was taking place, where they met Woody Harrelson's character, and they used a gray screen. So we looked at all the dailies of how they did Solo, and I obviously spoke to Rob Brado, that was on that show, and a bunch of other people that were boots on the ground. And we looked at the pros and cons. We even talked to the compositors that worked on those sequences, looked at the plates and looked at the befores and afters, and we TC largely did all that legwork, but we came to the conclusion that, you know, we want to lean into the gray screen. And, you know, it's not something we've done on our shows, and there's a few people a little bit nervous. And we were fortunate that Q, the DP, wanted to shoot some tests, or needed to shoot some tests anyway. So we tested it, and then everybody was on board. But more than that, it allowed Dave to really put as much atmosphere as he wanted to in the stage, because it was a very small stage we were working in, and because there wasn't a blue screen back there that was being lit artificially from the scene, that wasn't contaminating the atmosphere. In addition to that, it wasn't a distracting element, this big blue thing back there, and the gray screens largely fell away into the background. So very quickly, Dave could look at the monitors and go, "This feels like what we've been talking about. This feels like the artwork," despite the fact that we were largely missing the silhouettes of the walkers going through, some of the troopers going through, and explosions silhouetting this stuff. So that was kind of the way we unpicked that one in particular. Talking about the Vader thing, that was largely that was always going to come down to the compositors and the artistry they would bring to those shots. We had the two elements. We had obviously Anakin in his Clone Wars outfit, and then of course we had the Vader outfit as well. One of the biggest questions we had is the height difference. You know, the height difference between Anakin and the height difference between Vader, and reconciling that a little bit. And because the way that when Anakin walks away from camera, he's largely a silhouette anyway. You're not really paying attention, I don't think, to necessarily to where his head is, where his shoulders are, and then those flashing moments to Vader. It really proved not to be an issue, but it was something that we were discussing with Dave very early on, at least something Dave was kind of bringing up as a potential concern and something to look out for.
Yeah, well, just a fascinating process to hear how that came together. And now a smaller effect I was quite intrigued by is with Thrawn's eyes. He's got that red glow to them, and again Anakin's eyes when he becomes, you know, that Sith version of himself. What was it like to work on a smaller effect like that, and one that's so important with characters' eyes, would you say?
That's actually they're a really important effect that, as you say, they're fairly insignificant on screen space, but they are probably some of the most important effects, because audiences connect with characters through their eyes, through their expression. So it was very important for Dave, of course, to make sure that Lars could perform. And so very early on, there was conversations about what sort of contact would he be able to wear that wouldn't irritate his eyes. He was very much in that role, so he was more than happy to be wearing contacts. But it was clear from early tests to Dave that we really needed to kind of work over the top of these in visual effects, of course. Now, the red contacts provided us a very clear delineation in the frame as to where his eyes were versus where his eyelashes were. So that actually helped. It provided us. It wasn't necessarily it wasn't a matte. It wasn't a mask that we could pull from, but it provided us a visual guide. And then again, it was something that we wanted to develop very, very early in the development, and it happened in prep, the end of prep, and into the early shoot. And because I was working with TC Harrison again, who's come from a compositing background and super talented, there was lots of things that we would basically pull out. And I would say to Dave, TC's here. He's on the stages. He's in the office with me. He's back and forth from San Francisco down to LA. Let's just have him working on this stuff with you, and we can just we do a slow burn on this, so you have time to really kind of process that. And so by the point we get to turnovers with the vendors, we already have a template to follow. And because TC's a compositor, he could probably even hand off a compositing template in the compositing application that the vast majority of the industry uses. So that was something that TC worked on, and it was over many, many, many months. Not constantly, but something we kept coming back to, and we kept reviewing with Dave when he felt like he wanted to kind of see what the progress was. And it was something we arrived at pretty quickly. And for me, it's all about providing Dave and or John in the Mandalorian show a variety. But it's also, you don't want to provide subtlety. When you're kind of starting with something like that, you really want to hit both ends of the spectrum. You want to do something that's super subtle, and then you want to do something that's a little bit ridiculous in terms of, really piercing glows. And then maybe a few versions in between, throw it out to Dave and just get his instant read. And when he just recoils at the glowing eyes, clearly we need to be at this end of the spectrum, and we can now go in with a subtlety in this particular band. The worst thing is to provide subtlety at the beginning and then constantly spin because you haven't really satisfied the creatives by providing things that challenge what they originally imagined.
Yeah, well, incredible, like you said, a small effect, but one that is so important. And another one I think is really important. Of course, there's so much iconic Star Wars imagery in this show, whether it be the spaceships, the lightsabers, the hyperspace, but then you add in magic powers as well. We see those stormtroopers rise up from the dead. The Night Sisters obviously using their abilities. Again, not something we've seen in live action before. So how challenging was it to work on that side of things? And again, to borrow from those animated shows and make it work in this live action series?
Yeah, I actually I did find that initially challenging to kind of wrap my head around, because my experience within Star Wars hasn't been in those kind of witchy magic visuals. But for Dave, it's old hat. He's been doing it for years. So initially, it was a case of what he didn't want to see was super helpful to me, and he would point out what we've seen before in other IP, in other movies, and he basically gave us a pretty broad creative description to play within. So at that particular point, that's where I kind of take my hat to the artists at Hybrid, one of our vendor partners, because we basically gave them Dave's visual verbal turnover and a few visuals that Doug had, and they had the time to be able to kind of go away and the resources, of course, to come back with a few ideas. And again, they did the same thing because we encouraged them. Feel free to do something a little bit wild and wacky, and something you think is a little bit more conservative and a little bit closer to what you've seen before in Clone Wars. And they were the ones that really worked through me with Dave to kind of get that look. And once we had that, it was something we passed around the other vendors. But in all honesty, it wasn't something that turned out to be a big challenge once the shot work started. It was largely a challenge for me just to kind of wrap my head around what it could be and what the implications of that could be and knock-on effects. If all of a sudden we needed to glow every single stormtrooper eye, then you're talking hundreds of shots and, over the course of the shots, many thousands of stormtrooper eyes. But Dave didn't want to do that. It was more about selling the eyes glowing when they kind of resurrected just in a few shots close to camera to reinforce. And then we just get into the rest of the work and not overly explain to the audience kind of what's happening with them, because obviously Dave wanted to make sure that he was able to apply his resources wisely across everything that's required in the show and across all the shots.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we've got some fantastic lightsaber battles in this series. And I know you, having worked on The Mandalorian, you've obviously, there's been the dark saber in that show, but not as much lightsaber action. And of course, the blades in this series, we're seeing some new colors, whether it be white or orange. So was that an enjoyable part of the process for you, getting those new colors and adding those to those action scenes? Or does it not really make a difference for you in that respect, in terms of how you like those scenes and things?
No, it makes a big difference, the different colors of the lightsaber. And you're right, we haven't done a lot of lightsaber work on the Mandalorian shows. Of course, obviously, Ahsoka appeared in season 2, episode 5. And we dealt with her lightsabers then, but white's a very different solve to colored. And I think that the first thing we needed to do was understand from Dave what aesthetic he was looking for. And the reason why I say that is because if you kind of lined up all the Star Wars content that ILM's developed over the past 50 years, the lightsabers, um, they vary. They vary depending on the technology that's available at the time. They vary on the aesthetic of the creators and or the filmmakers, and it's always the filmmakers in terms of what it is that they want to do. Sometimes you can look at Obi-Wan, and the amount of light that those lightsabers throw off is far more than what we wanted to do. Sorry, far more than what Dave wanted to do, I should say. So it really started with kind of sitting down with Dave, showing him what was already being done. And let me be clear, I'm not showing him anything he's not already aware of, but it allows us to not talk about what people are imagining and actually what people have already done. So we lined it all up. He was very familiar with it. He already knew what he wanted to try and replicate, and he kept talking about George's original vision, the original movies. And even when you line those shots up, even across Return of the Jedi, even across one particular scene in Return of the Jedi, it varies. And again, it's largely down to the techniques that were being used back then. And so we wanted to kind of provide for Dave a vocabulary that was familiar, that would be helpful to all of us to understand what was that he wanted to create. So he wanted to do the flash. Now, in the original movies, that single frame flash, when they connected, didn't happen all the time, but when it did, oftentimes it was green, despite the fact that sometimes it wasn't a green lightsaber. So we started doing some tests with lightsabers. We started with the green, and then we would dial down the saturation, something a little bit more akin to a blend of the colors that would be fighting, or one particular dominant blade in that fight. He was very receptive to that. The big thing for Dave is the fact that the cores of all lightsabers are white, and it blends to a color on the outside that gives off that color as a glow. And so working on making sure that that core remained as close to white as we could without it feeling too synthetic, and making sure it felt like it was the emissive point of the light that it was throwing. So it's not straightforward. And there is a recipe that we developed that, all shows have, that we then had to make sure was policed right away through the show, because there are many, many, many different vendors that are touching lightsabers. And some of the vendors that we used on this show kind of jumped on just for Ahsoka. They hadn't had the history of working with us. They'd never worked on Star Wars before. And so TC worked with them very closely to kind of, again, with his compositing background, to turn over what that recipe was, what we do like, what we don't like. We gave them examples of both of those. We gave them examples of what was working across our show really well. And then as the show developed, we would switch out that what we call the hero takes. So the best looking lightsaber shots, we would constantly switch those out with better and better and better shots. So by the time the show was ending, every vendor's looking at the same collection of hero shots that Dave's approved, and we all think are the flavor of what we wanted to achieve.
Yeah, well, all amazing lightsaber sequences in this show. And you've mentioned Dave a lot, and I'm a huge fan of his. He's a fantastic creator in this world, and I'm sure he must have come to the show with some very specific ideas. And a lot of time has passed since Rebels, and this really is his corner of the Star Wars universe. So I know you're working on the Ghosts, the Chimera, those Mortis God statues, the Purgil. So, but for you as a VFX supervisor who knows what you can achieve and knows what your teams can achieve, what's it like working with Dave in that way, and obviously realizing his ideas, but in a way that's realistic and can keep you in budget, and what you're capable of bringing to the screen in a convincing way?
I honestly, I think it's a Dave's a VFX soup and visual effects artist's dream to work with, because first and foremost, he has a huge respect for the work that ILM has done historically, going right back to George. He's very well aware of those individuals, what it takes to develop that work, and also what very quickly knocks visual effects work off the rails. And very quickly, you know, the more you touch something, the more you end up with something that's you know, less than what you originally wanted because you're constantly touching it. So he's great because he sets this stall out at the beginning of a show. He visualizes everything. We would, you know, we have what we call these whiteboard sessions where Dave reads through the script, and after every scene or every moment with important moment within a scene, he'll do his football play. So on the whiteboard, he'll draw exactly where people are, and this goes right back to how he used to work as a storyboard artist, but also obviously working alongside George, developing the Clone Wars and event, and then beyond that, Rebels. So that's nothing new, but it is new to us in visual effects, having somebody that comes in with such a very, very clear idea of what they wanted to achieve. And oftentimes this whiteboard, he would draw the visual. This is the key visual of this particular scene. And, you know, whether it's, you know, a rock formation with the howler that's kind of framed in the foreground, and then you've got the big structure in the background. And so all this information, you're writing it down, you're drawing it, and then you're collecting those images from people photographing the screen, obviously with their recording it as well. It's huge. It's fantastic. But by the same token, he never limits the scope of what his storytelling could be based upon what's achievable. He trusts all his heads of departments to go away, to fully understand what's being asked, and then come back with him and work with him to shape what he's asking for, to make sure it is attainable. Because the worst thing in the world, of course, and it's not unknown, is to shoot the show and then realize that you have half the budget required to finish it. There's plenty of instances where that's happened. And that's not how Dave works. He's incredibly responsible for what his words mean and what he asks for. So just as important is what he is asking for is what he's not asking for. So those whiteboard sessions, as an example, become incredibly important and are things that it's vital that I listen and remember what he said, because a year from then, I'll be doing a turnover with the vendors where I'm basically passing along all the information he's provided to make sure that their first version of the shot is exactly what he expects it to be, and not something that's an alternative. Because that would be the worst thing in the world, particularly with how much work he puts into visualizing and developing it. Because what he talks to at the beginning of the show is what you produce at the end. We are not deviating. It is a pretty straight path that we follow.
Wow, amazing. Well, Richard, congratulations on the series. I'm a big fan of your work from Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, right down to Smuggler's Run. So it's been great.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you about this one. And like I said, the show is phenomenal and looks amazing. So thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, you're welcome, Josh. Thank you.
Hope to do it again soon. Thanks so much, Richard.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.